It was a peaceful afternoon in Marview, the kind of day where nothing seemed out of place. The sun cast a warm glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood, and the streets buzzed with the calm rhythm of daily life. Julia Thompson, a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, had just finished her usual grocery run. She was well known in the community, always friendly, with a calm demeanor that made her easy to talk to. Her son, Marcus, had recently moved back in with her after returning from his final deployment in the military. He was a quiet man, reserved, but people in the neighborhood knew him as a figure of respect. Few understood the depth of his experiences, though everyone appreciated the way he cared for his mother. As Julia made her way home, she decided to take a short detour through the park, a simple pleasure she indulged in from time to time. It was a place that reminded her of peaceful memories, where she had spent many afternoons with Marcus when he was a child. She sat down on her favorite bench, taking in the scenery, her thoughts drifting as the leaves rustled in the breeze. Everything about the moment felt ordinary, serene, until she noticed a patrol car slowly rolling by, 2 officers inside. The officers were unfamiliar, part of a new task force assigned to the area. They hadn't been in Marview long, and while the locals had heard stories about their heavy-handed approach, nobody had thought much of it. But when the car stopped and the officers stepped out, their eyes locked onto Julia as if she had done something wrong. The younger of the 2, Officer Daniels, seemed particularly aggressive, his brow furrowed as if he were dealing with a criminal. His partner, Officer Blake, a bit older and more seasoned, watched quietly but didn't intervene. Daniels approached Julia, his tone cold and commanding. "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" His question carried a weight that didn't match the simple scene of an elderly woman sitting on a park bench. Julia, surprised but not yet alarmed, replied with her usual calmness, "Just taking a rest." "Is there a problem, officer?" Daniels glanced at Blake, then back at Julia, his impatience growing. "You shouldn't be loitering here. This is a public space, not a resting spot." Julia was taken aback. She'd sat on this very bench countless times without issue. She gathered her thoughts, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm not causing any harm, officer. Just passing through after getting my groceries." Daniels's eyes narrowed. Something about Julia's response seemed to irritate him. He was a man who expected obedience, and her gentle tone, though respectful, felt like defiance to him. "I asked you to move along," he said, stepping closer, his posture aggressive. "Or do you want me to help you?" Blake shifted uneasily, but didn't say anything. He had seen Daniels like this before, overreacting to minor situations. Julia, sensing the tension rise, tried to diffuse it. "I'm sorry if I've upset you, officer. I'll be on my way." But as she stood, her legs a little unsteady from the sudden shift, Daniels reached out and grabbed her arm. The action was unnecessary, forceful. Julia gasped, more in surprise than pain, and stumbled. Her cane slipped from her hand as she fell, hitting the ground hard. The small crowd of bystanders, who had started to gather as the scene unfolded, let out murmurs of shock and disapproval. A few took out their phones, recording what was happening. Daniels didn't let go. He pulled Julia back to her feet, his grip tightening. Julia winced, trying to pull away, her body shaking from a mix of fear and disbelief. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "you're hurting me." Before the officer could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let her go." It was Marcus. He had arrived in his truck just as the scene began to spiral out of control. From the moment he saw his mother on the ground, his mind raced with a mixture of disbelief and rage. Years of military discipline flooded his instincts, but the sight of Julia, his strong, kind mother, being treated this way by the very people meant to protect her, pushed him to the edge. Daniels turned, his face hardening when he saw Marcus approaching, his jaw clenched. Marcus was a large man, muscular from years of service, his presence immediately commanding. "This is none of your business," Daniels said, still holding on to Julia. "It's my business when it's my mother." Marcus shot back, his voice steady but laced with anger. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Daniel's, the tension between them palpable. Marcus wasn't yelling, wasn't out of control, but there was an intensity in him that everyone could feel. Blake, sensing that this was about to escalate further, tried to intervene. Daniels, let's take a step back. We don't need to. But Daniels wasn't listening. His pride was already on the line, and in his mind, backing down in front of the growing crowd would make him look weak. He held his ground, tightening his grip on Julia, just enough for her to wince again. Marcus saw the pain in her face, and his patience snapped. In a flash, he closed the distance between them, grabbing Daniels' wrist with precision and strength, forcing him to release his grip. Daniels recoiled, surprised by the sudden move, but before he could react further, Marcus stepped between him and his mother. Julia was trembling, her breath uneven, as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Marcus kept his focus on the officers, his eyes burning with controlled fury. You touch her again, and we'll have a problem. Do you understand? The crowd, now larger, watched in stunned silence. Some were whispering to each other, others still recording, waiting to see how this would unfold. Daniels, momentarily thrown off by Marcus's calm but fierce demeanor, took a step back. Blake, trying to salvage the situation, finally spoke up. There's no need for this to get any worse. Let's all calm down. But for Marcus, the damage had already been done. His mother, the woman who had raised him, supported him through everything, had been humiliated and hurt, and the police, who he had once trusted, had been the ones responsible. He wanted nothing more than to unleash the anger boiling inside him, but years of training kept him in check. Julia, her voice barely a whisper, tried to calm her son. Marcus, please. It's over. Let's go home. But Marcus knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the officers backed away, the tension in the air was thick, but the confrontation had come to an uneasy pause. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of disbelief and outrage echoing through the park. Marcus guided his mother back to his truck, his hand shaking slightly as he helped her in. As they drove away, Marcus's mind raced. He could feel the storm brewing inside him. This wasn't going to end here. His mother had been hurt, humiliated, and the people responsible needed to be held accountable. What Daniels didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just another angry civilian. He had resources, connections, people who owed him favors from his time in the military. And when those connections came into play, Marcus knew that the officers involved wouldn't see it coming. Back home, Julia tried to downplay the event, telling Marcus she was fine. But Marcus couldn't let it go. He called an old friend from his military days, a lawyer who specialized in cases involving abuse of authority. The wheels were already turning, and Marcus was about to show those officers that they had made the worst mistake of their lives. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As Marcus drove home, the silence in the truck was deafening. Julia, seated beside him, was still visibly shaken, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stared out the window, trying to process what had just happened, but her mind was swirling in a haze of confusion and disbelief. Marcus glanced over at her, his heart heavy with anger and concern. His mother had always been his rock, the one person who had been there for him through everything, and seeing her hurt like this triggered something deep inside him. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Julia sighed, breaking the silence. "Marcus, please don't do anything rash," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "It was a misunderstanding. I don't want to cause any more trouble." But Marcus wasn't hearing it. He helped her out of the truck and guided her into the house, his jaw clenched, barely able to keep his emotions in check. Inside, he sat her down on the couch, taking a moment to assess the bruise forming on her arm from where Daniels had grabbed her. The sight of it made his stomach turn. It was a stark reminder of how vulnerable she had been in that moment. The woman who had raised him, protected him, now needed protection of her own. and Marcus was ready to provide it, no matter what it took. Julia looked at him with tired eyes. "I'm fine, really. There's no need to get involved any further." Marcus shook his head. "No, Mom. This is more than just an incident. This is about respect, about how people in power treat those they think are beneath them. You didn't deserve this, and they need to know that." Julia remained quiet, her mind drifting back to the park, replaying the incident in slow motion. She didn't want Marcus to be consumed by anger, especially not after everything he had been through in the military. But she knew her son. Once his mind was set, there was little she could do to stop him. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his office, the house quiet around him. He had spent the last few hours reviewing the video footage sent to him by neighbors who had witnessed the altercation. The videos, grainy but clear enough to show what had happened, captured every detail: Daniels's aggressive posture, the rough handling of Julia, and Marcus's confrontation. He watched them again and again, his anger growing with each replay. It wasn't just about the physical harm. It was about the sheer disrespect, the abuse of power that had been so casually wielded against his mother. He knew the police department would try to downplay the incident, sweep it under the rug as another misunderstanding. But Marcus had seen this kind of behavior too many times before, both at home and during his deployments overseas. People in power always tried to cover for their own, especially when they believed their victims couldn't fight back. Marcus was determined to show them that this time, they had picked the wrong family. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of his old friend, Travis Bennett, a former military lawyer who had transitioned into civilian life and now specialized in civil rights cases. Travis had helped a number of veterans with legal issues, and Marcus knew that if anyone could take on the police department, it was him. "Travis, it's Marcus," he said when his friend answered. "I need your help." Travis didn't need any convincing. After hearing Marcus's account of what had happened, he was immediately on board. "Send me the footage," he said. "I'll look it over tonight, and we'll plan the next steps. This kind of thing can't go unanswered." Marcus sent the videos and sat back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His thoughts kept drifting back to the officers, especially Daniels. The man had been completely out of line, and Marcus knew there was more to his behavior than just a bad day. He could see the arrogance in Daniels's face, the way he had manhandled Julia without a second thought. That kind of attitude came from a sense of entitlement, a belief that no one could hold him accountable. But Marcus was about to change that. The next morning, Marcus went to check on Julia before leaving the house. She was still resting, a blanket wrapped around her as she sipped her tea. "I'm heading out for a bit, Mom," he said quietly. "I've got a few things to take care of." Julia gave him a knowing look but didn't protest. "Just be careful," she said softly. Marcus nodded and left, his mind already focused on his next move. He drove to the police station, knowing that filing a formal complaint was the first step. But as he walked through the doors, he could feel the tension in the air. The station was busy, officers milling about, talking in low voices. Marcus approached the front desk and requested to speak with the supervisor on duty. Sergeant Harris, the officer in charge, came out after a few minutes, his face neutral as he greeted Marcus. "What can I do for you today?" he asked. "I'd like to file a complaint against Officers Daniels and Blake for their actions yesterday," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Harris' expression didn't change, but Marcus could sense the unease behind his eyes. "I'll need to hear the details," he said. Marcus recounted the events, leaving nothing out. He explained how Daniels had escalated the situation unnecessarily, how he had used excessive force against his mother, and how Blake had stood by without intervening. As he spoke, he could see Harris scribbling notes, but the surgeon's disinterest was evident. "We'll look into it," Harris said after Marcus finished. "These things take time, but we'll follow up." Marcus could see where this was going. It was the same old routine. File a report, let it sit in a drawer, and hope it fades away. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. He handed Harris a copy of the video footage on a flash drive, meeting the surgeon's gaze. "This isn't going away," he said, his voice low and filled with quiet determination. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. If this doesn't get handled properly, we'll take it higher." Harris didn't respond immediately, but Marcus could tell that his words had struck a nerve. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Thompson," he said carefully. "We'll be in touch." Marcus left the station, knowing that he had just set the wheels in motion. But he wasn't naive. He knew the police would try to cover their tracks, minimize the damage. That's why his next step was to ensure the public knew what had happened. Over the next few days, Marcus began reaching out to local news outlets, sharing the footage and telling his story. At first, it was just a few small reports on community blogs, but as more people saw the video, it began to gain traction. Social media exploded with outrage as people shared the footage and demanded accountability. The story spread like wildfire, and soon, larger news organizations picked it up. Marcus's phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, activists, and even a few sympathetic officers who were disgusted by what had happened. Meanwhile, Julia watched from the sidelines, her heart heavy with concern for her son. She had never wanted this much attention, never wanted to be at the center of a public battle. But as she watched the growing support for Marcus and the outrage over her treatment, she began to understand why her son couldn't let this go. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up to a system that allowed people like Daniels to act with impunity. The pressure mounted on the police department as public outcry intensified. The mayor's office got involved, calling for an independent investigation, and the officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. But Marcus knew that wasn't enough. He wasn't looking for a temporary fix. He wanted real justice, not just for his mother, but for anyone who had ever been mistreated by those in power. The battle was far from over, but Marcus was ready for whatever came next. The police had underestimated him, dismissed him as just another angry civilian. But what they didn't realize was that Marcus was a fighter, and once he started, he wasn't going to stop until the truth came out. As the investigation began to unfold, Marcus received a call from Travis. "It's time," Travis said. "We're going to take this to court. I've got everything we need." And with that, Marcus knew they were just getting started. The courtroom was silent, a heavy air of anticipation filling the space. Marcus sat beside Travis at the plaintiff's table, his jaw clenched as he waited for the proceedings to begin. It had been weeks since the incident in the park, weeks filled with media attention, public outcry, and endless preparation for the legal battle ahead. Marcus had spent hours reliving every moment of that day, every detail that had led to his mother being assaulted by those who were supposed to protect her. Now it was time to make sure the truth came out. Julia sat quietly in the front row behind Marcus, her hands folded in her lap. She still didn't like all the attention, but she understood why Marcus had pushed so hard. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up to a system that had failed too many times. She was proud of Marcus for taking action, though part of her wished this nightmare would end so they could return to their quiet lives. The defense table was a stark contrast. Officers Daniels and Blake sat there, their faces stern but betraying a hint of discomfort. They were flanked by the police union's legal team, a group of seasoned attorneys who had seen this kind of case before. Their strategy was clear from the beginning. Downplay the severity of the incident, paint Daniels' actions as a necessary response to a perceived threat, and shift focus away from the brutality of what had happened. Marcus knew this was going to be a fight, but he was prepared for it. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. The video footage was the centerpiece of their case, showing the entire interaction from the moment Daniels approached Julia to the moment Marcus intervened. Each clip was played in front of the jury, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief as they watched the elderly woman being dragged to her feet, her pleas for help ignored by the officers who were supposed to be serving the community. The evidence was damning. and the tension in the room was palpable as the prosecution finished its opening statement. Then it was time for the defense to make their case. Their lead attorney, a sharp and calculating man named Walter Briggs, stood up and began spinning a narrative that twisted the facts. He painted Julia as uncooperative, suggesting that she had refused to follow police instructions and that Daniels had been forced to take action to prevent a larger disturbance. He framed Marcus's intervention as aggressive, claiming that the officers had felt threatened by his imposing presence and military background. Briggs's words were smooth, but the tone of his argument left a bitter taste in Marcus's mouth. It was the same tired defense he had seen time and time again: blame the victim, justify the use of force, and deflect responsibility. As the first few witnesses took the stand, it became clear that the defense was trying to discredit every aspect of the case. They called on a few officers who hadn't been at the scene, but had worked with Daniels and Blake, vouching for their character and professionalism. One by one, these witnesses tried to reinforce the idea that Daniels's actions had been reasonable under the circumstances. Marcus sat there, seething, as he listened to their carefully rehearsed testimonies. They were trying to make it seem as though this was just another routine encounter, as if dragging an elderly woman to the ground was an acceptable part of police procedure. But then it was Marcus's turn. When Travis called him to the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Marcus walked up with steady steps, his expression calm but intense. As he took his seat, he glanced over at Julia, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Travis approached, his voice measured as he began asking Marcus to recount what had happened that day. Marcus spoke with precision, detailing the events exactly as they had unfolded. He described how his mother had simply been resting on the park bench, how Daniels had approached her without cause, how his mother had complied but was still assaulted. His voice remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of anger that rippled through his words. When Travis asked him about his decision to intervene, Marcus didn't hold back. "I saw my mother, a woman who has spent her entire life teaching and caring for others, being treated like a criminal," Marcus said, his voice tightening with emotion. "I acted because no one else was. She was being hurt, and it was my duty to protect her." The defense tried to rattle him during cross-examination. Briggs approached with the kind of smug confidence that Marcus had come to expect from people who thought they could intimidate him. Briggs questioned Marcus's account, suggesting that his military background had made him overreact, that he had escalated the situation by intervening the way he did. He tried to paint Marcus as a threat, implying that his presence had made the officers feel cornered. Marcus didn't flinch. He answered every question with the same calm authority he had learned in the field. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make any threatening moves. I simply asked him to release my mother," Marcus said, his eyes locked on Briggs. The only one escalating the situation was Officer Daniels. The courtroom was silent as Marcus finished speaking. Briggs, clearly frustrated that he hadn't been able to shake Marcus's testimony, quickly ended his cross-examination. Next, it was Julia's turn. When she took the stand, the atmosphere shifted. Julia's frail frame and quiet demeanor were a stark contrast to the hardened police officers and legal professionals in the room. Travis guided her gently through her testimony, asking her to describe how she had felt during the encounter. Julia's voice wavered at times, but she spoke with clarity. She explained how she had felt confused and afraid, how she hadn't understood why the officers were being so rough with her when she had done nothing wrong. The jury watched her intently, their faces softening as she spoke. Then, Travis asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. "Julia, at any point, did you resist the officers or refuse to comply with their instructions?" Julia shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No. I did everything they asked." The defense tried to poke holes in her story, but it was futile. Julia's testimony, combined with the video evidence, made it clear that there had been no justification for the force used against her. As she stepped down from the stand, Marcus could see the toll the trial was taking on her, but he also saw the quiet strength in her eyes. She was fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by those in power. As the trial progressed, the momentum seemed to shift. More witnesses were called, including several neighbors who had been at the park that day. Their testimonies backed up Marcus and Julia's version of events, painting a picture of a needless use of force by the police. The video footage had been shared widely online by this point, and the public pressure was mounting. News outlets covered the trial daily, and the community was divided. Some stood firmly with Marcus and his mother, while others defended the police, unwilling to believe that their local officers could act so recklessly. But the turning point came when Officer Blake was called to the stand. Up until that point, Blake had stayed in the background, letting Daniels and the defense team do the talking. But as he sat in the witness chair, something in his demeanor changed. Blake was older, more experienced than Daniels, and it became clear that the weight of the situation was starting to get to him. Under Travis's questioning, Blake hesitated. He tried to stay loyal to his partner, but when Travis presented him with the video footage, showing Blake standing by while Daniels assaulted Julia, the cracks in his defense began to show. "Officer Blake," Travis said, his voice calm but firm, "at any point during the encounter, did you believe that Julia Thompson posed a threat to you or your partner?" Blake shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between the jury and the prosecution. He swallowed hard. "No," he finally admitted. The room was dead silent. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. A confession from one of the officers that there had been no threat, no justification for what had happened. Marcus's heart raced as he watched Blake struggle with his conscience, clearly torn between loyalty to his fellow officer and the truth that was now impossible to deny. As Blake stepped down, the defense's case began to crumble. They had tried to frame the situation as a necessary use of force, but Blake's testimony had destroyed that narrative. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial neared its conclusion. Marcus could feel the tide turning in their favor, but he knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The final days of the trial were a blur of closing arguments and emotional appeals. Travis delivered a powerful statement, reminding the jury that this case wasn't just about one incident. It was about accountability, about ensuring that those in positions of power were held responsible when they crossed the line. He urged them to think about the message their verdict would send to the community and to remember the pain and suffering that Julia had endured. The defense, for their part, tried to salvage what they could, but it was clear that their arguments were losing steam. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but when they finally returned, the verdict was unanimous. Officers Daniels and Blake were found guilty of excessive force and misconduct. As the judge read the verdict, Marcus felt a surge of relief wash over him. Justice had been served. He turned to Julia, who smiled softly through her tears. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about standing up for what was right, about holding those in power accountable. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered, some celebrating, others still divided. But one thing was clear: the incident had sparked a conversation that wouldn't be silenced. The police department would have to reckon. The days following the verdict were filled with a strange combination of relief and tension. On one hand, Marcus and Julia had won the case, and justice had been served in the courtroom. But outside those walls, the world seemed to be shifting. The trial had ignited a firestorm of debate across the town of Marview. In every corner of the community, people were talking about what had happened, about the broader issues it raised, and about what this meant for their town and the police force they had trusted for so long. For Marcus, the victory in court had been a crucial step, but it didn't feel like the end. The public outcry against the police department was growing louder, and while some people supported the Thompson family and their fight for justice, others were vocal in their defense of the officers involved. It was a polarizing issue, and Marview, once a quiet suburban town, was now at the center of a conversation about police accountability, use of force, and the abuse of power. The day after the trial, Marcus was at home with Julia, trying to find some peace after weeks of stress. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, while Julia rested in the living room. The house was unusually quiet, but that silence was broken by a knock at the door. Marcus tensed, wondering if it was a reporter or someone from the media. They had been relentless in the days leading up to the trial, and even though Marcus had expected the attention, it had worn him down. He opened the door cautiously, but it wasn't a journalist standing there. Instead, it was a man Marcus hadn't seen in years, an old army buddy, Darren Caldwell, who had served with Marcus during one of his earlier deployments. Darren had heard about the trial and had come to check on his friend, offering support in a way that only someone who had been through the same battles could. "Marcus, man, I saw what you've been dealing with. Thought I'd stop by," Darren said, stepping inside. Marcus hadn't realized how much he needed to see a familiar face, someone who understood the kind of pressure he was under without needing to ask 1,000 questions. They sat at the kitchen table, catching up for a bit before the conversation turned to the trial. Darren had been following the case from a distance, and as they talked, it became clear that Darren shared the same frustrations that Marcus had. Both men had served their country, fighting for the rights and freedoms of others, only to return home to a system that seemed broken. "I'm proud of you for standing up to them," Darren said, his voice low but firm. "Not many people would have had the guts to do what you did. But I gotta ask, what's next?" Marcus looked at him, not entirely sure of the answer. Winning the court case had felt like a victory, but the more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that the fight wasn't over. The verdict had been a wake-up call for the town, but it hadn't fixed the underlying issues. The officers who had wronged his mother might face disciplinary action, but there were still others on the force who shared their mentality. And those were the people who worried Marcus the most. "I don't know, man," Marcus said, shaking his head. "We won the case, but I feel like this is just the beginning. The department's still trying to protect their own. Even now, after everything, they're more worried about covering their backs than making real changes." Darren nodded in understanding. "That's how it always is. Accountability's a nice word to throw around, but it's a whole different story when it comes to actually enforcing it. So what are you thinking? Are you going to let it go, or are you going to push them further?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus had been thinking about that very thing. He didn't want to become obsessed with this fight, but at the same time, he couldn't just sit back and watch as the town and the police department moved on, as if nothing had happened. He owed it to his mother and to everyone else in the community who had been wronged by people in power. "I don't think I can let it go," Marcus admitted after a long pause. "Not yet. There are too many people out there who've been hurt, just like my mom, and they never got their day in court. I can't walk away from this knowing that there's still work to be done." Darren leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You ever think about getting involved with the community? I mean, really getting involved. If the department won't change from the inside, maybe the people on the outside can force them to. You've got influence now. People know your name. They know what you stand for. You could make some serious waves if you wanted to." Marcus hadn't considered that before. He had always been the kind of person who preferred to stay in the background, doing his job without drawing attention to himself. But Darren's words struck a chord. Maybe there was something he could do. Maybe he could use the momentum from the trial to push for real change in Marview. He didn't know exactly how, but the idea of getting involved in a more active way started to take shape in his mind. That evening, after Darren left, Marcus sat down with Julia to talk about what came next. She had been through so much, and he didn't want to drag her into anything else if she wasn't ready. But to his surprise, Julia was the one who encouraged him to keep going. "You've always been strong, Marcus," she said, her voice soft but full of conviction. "You've always fought for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. This town needs people like you now more than ever. If you feel like there's more to be done, then do it. Don't let fear or doubt hold you back." Marcus looked at his mother, her words resonating deeply. Julia had always been his source of strength, the person he turned to when he needed guidance. She had been the one to teach him about standing up for justice, about the importance of doing what was right, even when it came at a cost. And now, even after everything she had been through, she was still encouraging him to fight. The next day, Marcus made a decision. He reached out to some of the local activists who had supported him during the trial, people who had been working to bring attention to issues of police misconduct and abuse of power in Marview for years. They met at a small community center, a group of about a dozen people, each of them with their own stories and experiences, each of them driven by the same desire for change. At that meeting, Marcus spoke for the first time about what had been weighing on him since the trial. He talked about how the justice system had failed too many people, how the police department had operated with impunity for too long. He talked about his mother, about the pain she had endured, and how it had opened his eyes to the larger problems that needed to be addressed. As he spoke, Marcus realized that this was what he had been searching for, a way to channel his anger, his frustration, and his desire for justice into something productive. The people in that room, some of whom had been fighting this battle for years, welcomed him with open arms. They saw in Marcus a leader, someone who could help amplify their voices and bring about the change they had been fighting for. Over the next few weeks, Marcus became deeply involved in the movement for police reform in Marview. He attended rallies, spoke at town hall meetings, and worked with local leaders to push for changes in police training and accountability. His military background gave him a unique perspective, and people listened when he spoke. He wasn't just another angry voice. He was someone who had fought for his country, and now he was fighting for his community. As the movement grew, so did the opposition. There were those in the town who didn't want to see the police department challenged, who believed that the officers had done nothing wrong and that the trial had been a miscarriage of justice. Tensions between supporters of the movement and defenders of the police rose, leading to heated debates in the local media and confrontations at public events. But Marcus wasn't deterred. He had faced worse in his life, and he knew that real change didn't come without resistance. He kept pushing, kept speaking out, and slowly the movement began to make progress. The police department was forced to implement new policies, and a civilian oversight board was established to review cases of misconduct. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Through it all, Julia remained Marcus's anchor. She watched with pride as her son took on this new role, leading a movement that was changing the town for the better. And while she still carried the scars of that day in the park, both physical and emotional, she knew that something good had come from it. The incident had sparked a reckoning, and the community was finally beginning to hold its leaders accountable. One evening, after a particularly heated town hall meeting, Marcus and Julia sat on their front porch, the cool night air swirling around them. Marcus looked out at the quiet street, reflecting on everything that had happened. "You did good, Marcus," Julia said, breaking the silence. "I know this isn't the life you thought you'd be living, but you've made a difference, and that's something to be proud of." Marcus nodded, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in months. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was content knowing that he had done the right thing. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The tension in Marview was thick, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Even though Marcus and Julia had won the trial and the officers responsible had been held accountable, the larger fight for justice in the community was far from over. As Marcus continued his work with local activists, pushing for broader reform within the police department, the town seemed to split down the middle. There were those who supported Marcus and the movement for change, and there were those who believed the police were being unfairly targeted, their authority undermined by people who didn't understand what it took to keep the peace. This divide became more visible as the weeks wore on. At first it was just small things, comments on social media, side glances at the grocery store, whispers in the streets. But soon, it escalated into more direct confrontations. A growing faction of Marview's residents began organizing counter-protests, rallying around the idea that law enforcement was being unjustly vilified. These groups, often emboldened by the national conversations about policing, carried signs that read, "Support our cops" and "Law and Order First." They claimed that Marcus and the activists were stirring up unnecessary trouble, that the police were just doing their jobs, and that Julia's case had been blown out of proportion. Marcus wasn't surprised. He knew this kind of pushback was inevitable. Anytime people tried to change the status quo, those who benefited from it fought back. But it didn't make it any easier to deal with. The tension in town wasn't just abstract anymore. It was personal. He could feel it everywhere he went. People who had once waved at him and his mother in passing now avoided eye contact. Others openly glared, their expressions full of resentment. One evening, as Marcus was leaving a community meeting, he was approached by a small group of men he recognized from one of the counter-protests. They were standing by their trucks, their faces hard and unreadable in the dim light of the parking lot. Marcus kept his pace steady as he walked to his car, but he could sense the hostility radiating off of them. As he unlocked his car door, one of them called out, "Hey, Thompson, you think you're some kind of hero, huh? Bringing down good men just for doing their job." Marcus turned slowly, meeting the man's gaze. He was tall, stocky, with a face that looked like it had seen its share of fights. His friends stood behind him, arms crossed, their postures tense. Marcus had dealt with intimidation tactics before, both in the military and since the trial, but something about this moment felt different, more personal, more dangerous. "I'm not trying to bring anyone down," Marcus said evenly. "I'm trying to make sure the people in this town are treated fairly. That includes everyone." The man sneered, stepping closer. "You've made your point, haven't you? You got a couple of cops suspended. You should quit while you're ahead. Don't make things worse." Marcus felt his hands tighten into fists, the old instincts from his military days kicking in. He had dealt with men like this before, bullies who thought they could scare people into backing down. But he also knew that giving in to his anger wouldn't solve anything. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus said, "but I'm not going to stop fighting for what's right. If you have a problem with that, you know where to find me." The man's sneer faltered for just a second, but his bravado quickly returned. "Don't say we didn't warn you," he muttered before turning and walking back to his group. Marcus watched them drive away, his pulse still racing. He knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to intimidate him. The fight for justice wasn't just happening in the courtroom or at town hall meetings. It was playing out in the streets, in everyday encounters, in the way people treated each other. And as much as he wanted to believe that the truth would eventually win out, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get worse before they got better. When Marcus returned home that night, Julia was waiting for him, her face lined with worry. She had heard about the rising tensions in town, about the threats and the counter-protests. Though she had always supported Marcus's fight for justice, she couldn't help but worry about the toll it was taking on him and on their family. "You need to be careful, Marcus," Julia said softly as they sat down at the kitchen table. "I know you're strong, but this isn't just about you anymore. These people, they don't like seeing their world change. They'll lash out." Marcus nodded, his mind still replaying the confrontation in the parking lot. "I know, Mom, but I can't just walk away. If we stop now, it'll send a message that what they're doing is okay. And it's not." Julia sighed, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I'm proud of you. I always have been. But I don't want to see you get hurt. You've been through so much already." Marcus squeezed her hand, appreciating the concern but knowing deep down that he couldn't back down. This fight wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about the entire community, about making sure that no one else had to endure what Julia had gone through. He had come this far, and turning back now wasn't an option. The following weeks were a blur of action. Marcus worked closely with the local activists, pushing for more reforms and holding meetings with town officials to ensure that the promises made in the aftermath of the trial were actually being implemented. At the same time, he was constantly looking over his shoulder, aware that the opposition was growing bolder. Anonymous threats began showing up in his mailbox, and a few times he noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his house, their occupants watching him a little too closely. One night, after a particularly heated town hall meeting where Marcus had spoken out about the need for civilian oversight of the police, he returned home to find the front window of his house shattered. Julia was already in bed, and Marcus's heart raced as he checked the rest of the house, making sure no one had broken in. It was clear that this wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was a message. Marcus stood in front of the broken window, staring at the shards of glass on the floor, his thoughts racing. He had expected resistance, but this was something different. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They were trying to send a clear warning. But as he stood there, feeling the anger and frustration bubbling up inside him, Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to be scared off. If anything, this only strengthened his resolve. The next day, Marcus called a press conference. Standing in front of the local courthouse, surrounded by supporters, he addressed the growing tensions in Marview. He spoke about the broken window, about the threats he had received, and about the larger issues of injustice that still plagued the town. "I'm not going to back down," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear. "We've come too far to stop now. This isn't just about one incident or one family. It's about making sure that every person in this community is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. And if anyone thinks they can intimidate us into silence, they're wrong." The speech was broadcast across the town, and while it galvanized Marcus's supporters, it also deepened the divide in the community. The lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back now. Marcus knew that he had chosen a difficult path, but it was one he was committed to seeing through to the end. In the weeks that followed, the situation in Marview continued to simmer, with both sides digging in their heels. The police department, under increasing pressure, began implementing more of the reforms that Marcus and the activists had been pushing for, but the changes were slow, and the resistance from certain factions of the town only grew stronger. Marcus found himself at the center of a movement that was bigger than he had ever anticipated, and while the weight of it sometimes felt overwhelming, he knew he was fighting for something that mattered. Through it all, Julia remained his source of strength. She had been through so much, and yet she continued to support Marcus in every way she could. The fight for justice had taken its toll on both of them, but together they faced each new challenge with determination and resolve. One evening, after another long day of meetings and phone calls, Marcus and Julia sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the quiet street. The light was fading, but the warmth of the day still lingered in the air. Marcus looked over at his mother, thinking about everything they had been through. "I'm not sure where this is all going to end," Marcus said quietly, "but I know we're doing the right thing." Julia smiled softly, her eyes filled with pride. "You always do what's right, Marcus. That's what makes you who you are." As they sat together in the fading light, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges were far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he was fighting for, and he knew he wouldn't stop until justice was truly served for everyone in Marview. The months that followed were some of the most difficult of Marcus's life. The divide in Marview had only grown deeper, and though he had seen some victories, policy changes within the police department, a new civilian oversight board, and a few officers being held accountable, it felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. The community had changed. The tension that lingered in the air wasn't just about politics or policies anymore. It was personal, and the once quiet streets now felt heavy with suspicion, anger, and mistrust. Marcus kept pushing forward, knowing that the fight wasn't just about his mother anymore. It wasn't even just about the police. It had become about the very fabric of the town itself. People were starting to question what kind of community Marview really was, and whether they were willing to confront the systemic issues that had been hidden beneath the surface for so long. The public rallies, the heated town hall meetings, and the nightly news reports had turned the town into a battleground of ideals, and Marcus found himself at the center of it all. Despite everything, Marcus refused to let the pressure break him. He had faced worse in the military, and he knew how to stay focused under fire. But what made this fight different was the emotional toll it took on him and his family. Every day brought new challenges, new threats, and new tests of his resolve. And through it all, Julia remained his constant support, her quiet strength giving him the courage to keep moving forward. But as much as Marcus tried to remain composed, the weight of it all began to show. The long days of fighting for change, the endless meetings, the confrontations with those who opposed him, it was wearing him down. The vandalism, the threats, the constant presence of tension in his hometown were things he couldn't ignore. One night, Marcus came home to find a note slipped under his door, its message chilling in its simplicity. "Leave now, before it's too late." Marcus knew it was just another attempt to scare him off, but something about that note stuck with him. He had seen enough violence and hatred in his life to know when things were on the verge of tipping over into something more dangerous. But as much as he worried about his safety, his thoughts always came back to Julia. She had already been through so much, and Marcus couldn't stand the thought of her being caught in the crossfire of this battle. Yet every time he considered stepping back, she reminded him why they were fighting in the first place. "You can't let them win," Julia told him one evening as they sat together in the living room. "If you back down now, everything we've done, everything we fought for, it'll mean nothing. You've already made a difference, Marcus. Don't let fear stop you from seeing it through." Marcus looked at his mother, her words cutting through the haze of doubt that had been clouding his mind. She had always been his guiding light, the person who grounded him when everything else felt uncertain. And once again, her quiet wisdom helped him refocus. He wasn't just fighting for himself or even for her anymore. He was fighting for the future of the town, for everyone who had ever been silenced or mistreated, for those who couldn't fight for themselves. In the days that followed, Marcus threw himself even deeper into the work. He knew the opposition wasn't going to stop, and that meant he couldn't stop either. He continued to meet with community leaders, working on new initiatives to bring real, lasting change to Marview. He pushed for more transparency from the police department, for better training programs, and for more oversight. But beyond the policy changes, Marcus was fighting to change the culture of the town itself, to build a community where people didn't have to live in fear of those in power, where everyone could feel safe and respected. The pressure reached a boiling point when a major protest was planned in front of the police station. The organizers, many of whom had been working with Marcus for months, hoped the protest would be a peaceful demonstration calling for further reforms. But the growing tensions in Marview had made peaceful demonstrations a dangerous gamble. Marcus knew there would be counter-protesters, and he also knew that things could escalate quickly if tempers flared. On the day of the protest, Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as people gathered. There were hundreds of them. Activists, community members, families with young children, all holding signs calling for justice and reform. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a feeling of hope in the air. For many of the people there, this was about more than just police reform. It was about reclaiming their town, about standing up for what they believed in. But as the protest continued, Marcus could feel the energy shift. Across the street, a group of counter-protesters had gathered, their signs reading "Back the Blue" and "Law and Order above all." The two groups shouted at each other, the tension mounting as the hours passed. Marcus kept a close eye on the situation, knowing that it wouldn't take much for things to spiral out of control. Then it happened. A rock sailed through the air from the counter-protesters' side, striking one of the activists in the crowd. It was like a spark igniting a powder keg. Within seconds, chaos erupted. People began shouting, pushing, and shoving. The police, who had been standing by, moved in quickly to try to break up the fighting, but the situation had already escalated beyond their control. Marcus, standing in the middle of it all, felt a surge of panic as he watched the peaceful protest devolve into a street brawl. He tried to wade through the crowd, pulling people back, urging them to stay calm, but it was no use. The anger, The frustration, the fear, it had all built up to this moment, and there was no stopping it. The sound of sirens filled the air as more police units arrived, and soon the street was filled with flashing lights and chaos. Marcus could feel the weight of failure pressing down on him. This wasn't what he had wanted. He had fought so hard to keep the movement peaceful, to show that they could bring about change without violence. But now, as he stood in the middle of the fray, he wondered if everything he had worked for was falling apart. But then, through the chaos, he saw something that gave him hope. A group of young activists, standing together, locked arm in arm, chanting for peace. Despite the violence erupting around them, they refused to be dragged into it. They stood firm, their voices rising above the noise, calling for calm, for justice, for unity. Marcus felt a surge of pride and resolve. This was what the fight was about, not the chaos, not the violence, but the strength of people coming together for something bigger than themselves. He realized then that the real victory wasn't in winning every battle or changing every policy. The real victory was in inspiring others to stand up, to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The protest eventually dissipated, with the police managing to separate the groups before things got any worse. But the damage had been done. The town was more divided than ever, and Marcus knew that there would be fallout from the day's events. Still, as he walked back to his car that evening, exhausted but determined, he felt a strange sense of peace. This was the reality of the fight for justice. It wasn't clean or easy. It was messy, difficult, and often painful. But it was worth it. In the weeks that followed, Marcus continued his work. He met with town officials to address the violence at the protest, and while the tension in Marview remained high, he could see the seeds of change taking root. More and more people were speaking out, joining the movement, and demanding accountability. Slowly but surely, things were shifting. One evening, as Marcus and Julia sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Marcus reflected on everything they had been through. The fight for justice had tested him in ways he never could have imagined, but it had also given him a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. "Do you think we'll ever see real change?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet. Julia smiled softly, her eyes filled with the same quiet strength that had always guided him. "We already have, Marcus. It may not seem like it now, but you've already changed this town. And that's something no one can take away." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. The road ahead was still long, and the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He knew that real change didn't happen overnight. It happened in moments of courage, in acts of defiance, in the quiet determination of people who refused to back down. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm golden light, Marcus knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. He had fought for justice. He had fought for his mother. And he would keep fighting. For Marview, for his community, and for a future where no one had to endure the pain that his family had endured. The battle was long, but Marcus knew that in the end, justice would prevail.